The main things, and almost straight away, is they went, this is so much easier. I can relax and pay attention. It's fun. I'm enjoying my coaching. The people I coach are enjoying it.
Hi, it's Karen. Welcome to Changing Rein. This week we are talking to coaching legend Marianne Davies. So if you're an equestrian coach or you're interested in learning how to become a better rider or how you can help your horse learn, this episode is for you. Marianne has a more or less lifelong interest in how people and horses learn. She is a senior coach developer at UK Coaching and she runs her own business, Dynamics Coaching. Marianne is a keen equestrian and has spent many years coaching riders and developing equestrian coaches, amongst other things. A quick heads up for listeners, Marianne is a pracademic. This means we get the best of both worlds, her vast experience working hands-on training coaches and horses, plus her cutting-edge research into coaching and skill acquisition. In this episode, you will learn that there is more than one learning theory. There are many. And the learning theory Marianne builds her coaching on is completely different to the behaviourist learning theory many of you will be familiar with from equitation science. Mita and I could do an entire season discussing the various theories that different training approaches are built on, and maybe at some stage we will dive into this area. But for now, it is probably enough to know that the learning theory of equitation science is built on the idea that things are linear. So stimulus response will be familiar to people, and that the horse in this learning paradigm or this approach to training and learning is that the horse is passive. They're simply responding to stimuli. In the ecological dynamic theory Marianne uses, it recognises that life really isn't that linear. It's complex with lots of elements all interacting with each other. And the horse isn't passive. The horse is an active participant in learning. This is such a great conversation. The first half, Marianne talks about the theory, and in the second half of the episode, she gives some really practical advice for riders and explains how to set up training situations so that you can help your horse learn. And last but not least, she has some great practical advice on how to become a better coach. So if you're a coach, you might really want to listen to this part. So some of the science we discuss early is complicated. I know that I have personally had to read some of Marianne's papers a few times so that I could wrap my head around the ideas. But her ideas are so worth the effort. I hope you'll stick with us, and if you have any questions, send them through, and if there is enough interest, we will do a bonus episode to really tease out these ideas. I really hope you enjoy the episode this week, and as always, thanks for listening. And if you love the podcast, please tell your friends, and it would be great if you could write a review and help others find the podcast. Let's go hear what Marianne's got to say. Hi. So when Mita and I embarked on our podcast adventure, one of the key things we wanted to do was showcase a range of perspective and approaches to horse keeping and training with a goal of sharing a big range of opportunities that are available to people for doing things differently and hopefully making things better. So today we are so lucky we have Marianne Davies joining us. She's both a practitioner and an academic, and she's currently working on her PhD. So she has a foot in both camps. That means all her ideas are very grounded in practical lived experience of working with horses and riders. So I'll have to say, Marianne, at times some of your work has blown my mind with the opportunities it presents to think about things differently and to do things differently. So we hope that everyone finds her as inspiring and interesting as we have. So welcome, Marianne.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, we normally start with I suppose, not so much your life story, Marianne, but maybe a couple of pivotal moments along the way that got you to where you are today.
Wow, that's a good question. Right. Okay. So I I think probably starting as a child, did a lot of outdoor sports, but horses were my obsession. I was completely, I guess like most of us, I was just horse mad. I spent my time in school drawing horses, and I spent my time outside playing with them. And we didn't have a lot of horses. I didn't do all the normal sort of competition stuff. So I spent a lot of my time just riding bareback and with a head collar and riding various ponies that we got. But when I finished school, the only thing I wanted to do was work with horses, and I went to a big establishment here in the UK, thinking this is going to be amazing, and it would be the whole of the rest of my life. And I was horrified at how they treated the horses there. Oh yeah, they all had beautiful stables and things, but there was a combination of a training yard and a dealer, and that was when I first saw things like wrapping and horses being locked up and things. And I just thought, this is not what I wanted. It was so different from my very sort of free childhood of probably a riding equivalent of playing backyard games for another sport, just being with my ponies. So I kind of did the next thing that I loved, which was get into outdoor pursuits. And so for many, many years, I just took people out, climbing, mountaineering, doing paddle sports. And then as soon as I could afford to, I had my own horses again. One of the other things that I did, though, was as part of that, was to work with search dogs. So I was in the mountain rescue. I did a lot of stuff in the mountain rescue, and I had a search dog. And I just remember my first degree. So there's a couple of bits in this. I had a child at 22, and I was in university, and I was paying a lot of attention to I was experimenting on him. Basically, he was my guinea pig, and we were doing all the stuff around how you learn and and I was looking at him and going, that kind of doesn't really match up, but I was very curious. Then I'd been taught all this coaching that was very coach centered, telling people what to do, telling them how to do it. And then I ended up then training search and rescue dogs to air scent in the mountains. And they were so ahead of their time. They were amazing. And I remember one of the early things that I was told about the dogs was, you can't teach a dog how to scent and hunt. That's what they're good at. But what you need to do is try and have some kind of build a communication so that they know what you would like them to do. And you can define the area you'd like them to search and what you'd like them to search for, which is basically a live human being. So we had this big melting pot, and I was very lucky, even in my undergrad, that the John Fazey, who was head of the Motor Learning and Motor Control there, had got hugely into what we called action systems then. So it was applying dynamical systems theory and complexity sciences to human movement and human development. So yeah, that was probably a key bit. And then I just stayed fascinated. I just stayed so engaged in that. So I went back and then did a research master's just before. It was actually just before the Wolf and Lathwaite paper on optimal theory, which is optimizing learning from using. It was external focus of attention primarily, and external focus of attention and intrinsic motivation. And my early research that was published, I think 94, 95, was in what we call contextual interference, which is basically how designing practice structure influences learning. And the idea there was repetitive practice and drills don't work. It's kind of like you chanting your times table. It goes once through the system, and then the brain kind of goes, this is really boring. We've done this. Switch off. So by changing and having to resolve that problem, you end up with poorer performance during practice, but superior retention and transfer. And so most of the practice used to be very drill-like, repeat, to try and get it perfect. We know that's really, whatever theoretical perspective you come from, we know that's really ineffective. It's much better to do what they call contextual interference. So do one thing, then go do something else, and then come back and do that again. Then go back and do something else, and then come back. So that you're your system is having to resolve that movement problem and find the solution again, pick up the information again. But I was getting more and more of an idea that, especially watching my son, that motivation and intention was so important. I witnessed him going to a club to kayak at 8 years old, and he'd been paddling with me for years, have one lesson with a coach and not get back in a boat for 10 years. And I was just like, wow, like this is something really important here, because if kids don't want to do stuff, then they're not going to learn. So I went back to uni. I had 2 supervisors in 2 completely different departments, because that was still before the days where we had this integrated across different disciplines, transdisciplinary teams. And they thought I was crazy. And then halfway through it, Wolf and Lathwaite published their optimal learning theory. And I remember my supervisor going, damn, someone else has thought of it. And I'm going, oh, thank God. I'm not crazy.
And you are now a PhD candidate, am I correct?
Yes, yeah. So this time I'm looking very, very specifically at exploring learning from an ecological dynamics perspective. So dynamical systems theory, ecological psychology, following, it's not so new. I mean, it's pretty well established now in human movements, but doesn't seem to have transferred across to equine. So I first read one of the papers on applying dynamical systems or complexity theory to human movements and learning would have been in the 90s as an undergrad. And it was a paper by Scott Kelsall. He's a neurologist, I think. And him and Michael Turvey, Peter Kolger, there's a whole group of people from mathematics and other disciplines like that all came together, and they were all studying motor learning and motor control, which we now call skill acquisition. But at that time, and still actually in many places, the dominant theory was that the brain learns programs like a computer. And then basically you look at the environment, you take in perceptual information, it gets compared to some kind of model in your head. So there's already a problem there, because if you can't perceive anything without already having knowledge of that environment to embellish it, how do we start in the first place? So this was kind of the stuff they were concerned about. They were like, well, there's this homunculus, this problem of infinite regress that we can't start without already having the information there with this model. There has to be a person to program the computer, and there isn't. So you're looking at information, you're taking it in, you're embellishing it with meaning from somewhere, then choosing a program that you've developed, hence the repetitive perfect practice, and then the body then runs that program a bit like a computer. And they were looking at this and saying, this just doesn't make sense. First of all, there's too much information, there'll be too many errors. How can you recover from a perturbation, from being pushed off balance, for example? Or anyone who's caught a coffee cup or a wine glass will know that we can do like amazing stuff. How do animals learn, or less complex, cognition in animals be able to do that, because this can't actually work. So they tried to start from scratch and go, right, we're going to take all of that away and assume that there is no program, there is no internal representation of the outside world, and see where we get to. And Scott Kelsall's paper was around coordination. And this is the idea that first of all, our movement system has it's self-organizing properties, and I know this blows people's minds. It's not being managed like a puppet. It's more like a tensegrity system. So think about your modern pop-up tents and the way they hold shape and recover. Plus, when we drive a car, for example, we don't have 4 steering wheels that we have to control each wheel, do we? So we're not driving there going, I've got to make sure all 4 of these wheels are perfectly aligned to get around a corner. They are connected. They're coupled to make one system. One steering wheel turns 4 wheels. And our body does a very similar thing. But those more complex movements as we learn, those coordination patterns, are things that we learn to do through moving around. And he'd use quadruped dynamics. So here is a paper about horses movement patterns, using it to support the way people move, and talking about phase transitions between things like a walk, a trot, canter. I was hooked. So I was like, wow, this is amazing.
Really interesting, and I think I'd be hooked if I read it. And I think you probably told me about it already, Marianne, and I still haven't read it. But I'll add it to my list. That's the trouble, isn't it? There's just so many things to read, and there's only so much time.
Yeah, they're very complex papers. So the Colger and Kelso, there's a lot of mathematics in there. You can skip the mathematics, but the basic concepts are amazing. And actually, then Newell's constraints model, which we have discussed this idea, and I'm sure we'll get into here, that sort of like the constraints on movement are what we use to try and support skill acquisition and help with learning. He based that on coordination, the papers around coordination, and coordinative structures as dissipative structures.
Because one of the things that I've really focused on your can't jump, won't jump paper, which I love that paper. And one of the things that really struck me, which I think would be really interesting for people listening, is your explanation of coaching based on a non-linear pedagogy, and explain the difference between a traditional approach and that approach. I think that would be great.
Yeah, so if we go back, so a traditional approach is very much based on that the computer model, that our brain has the information and we can convey it by telling somebody something, put your shoulders back, look up, heels down, whatever we are, give a little squeeze on the inside rein. So you're giving this information that we sort of nicknamed second-hand information. It's not specifying, because we want the rider to pick up the information from the horse, basically, or something like that. But the idea that you can, and repetitive practice means that you're building this correct program that you can then use and apply into other environments, and then parameterize it if you need to, if that environment's not exactly the same. And so it comes from that information processing theory. And so nonlinear pedagogy, I say, is based on this ecological dynamics theory, which is we organize movements to achieve things. And this is where the term affordances comes in, and it'll feel a little sort of sticky to people to begin with, but it's incredibly powerful. And I know it's used hugely now in things like design of buildings, and even your computers and things like that, and design of living environments. And basically, affordance, at its simplest term, is an opportunity for action. There is specific to that individual. So all of these theories are very much not just human, it's just all organisms, how all organisms move and learn to move more effectively within their ecological niche in the way that they need to. So the horses, the affordances that horses will pick up will be different from us. They have different intentions, usually around keeping safe and being with other horses, finding food, etc. We often use this word Umwelt. Have you heard of the term Umwelt? Which is like the world experienced by that organism. And horses, I sometimes see apps that say, this is how a horse sees, and then it shows a picture of exactly how I see, because it's just red-green colourblind. And that's not how a horse sees, because a horse has experienced the world as a quadruped, as a prey animal, with nearly 360-degree vision, stuff that we can't imagine, because we're not horses. And we can imagine a little bit, but we not really. And with the movements of a quadruped, and the perceptual information and the proprioception and the haptic perception of a quadruped. So it's like, how do we want to create, when we're training, movement opportunities for a horse to solve, and going back to the contextual interference, how can I create movement opportunities for the horse to solve, so that horse is learning to be more skillful in this environment that we've created and that we want it to. And there's a few things that are really important there. First of all, the biggest constraint a horse has is the rider. It's got to carry a weight that's probably a little bit like trying to carry an aqua bag, that's a bit fidgety. and wobbling, and then is trying to also tell the horse how it should be moving, where it should be going. So it's a little bit like, I kind of imagine it like us carrying a rucksack with a wriggly monkey in, or a kid, as an adult, if you've ever had one of the, then he's saying, I want you to go there, do this, like, oh. So being mindful that the first thing our horses have to do that's really important is learn to carry us, but properly carry us, lift their back up and actually carry us instead of just like sink underneath us. That's probably the most important thing. Then we have the 3 sets of constraints, which are the horses, or organismic, which is their individual constraints. So, how it's feeling, and they'll change, how the horse is it fresh? Is it tired? How much has it learnt? How old is it? So there'll be structural ones, and then there'll be functional ones. So more long-term, more short-term. We've got the task constraints then. So we might be talking about show jumping, for example, which is nice and easy. You set up a show jumping course. Those are your task constraints. And then the environmental constraints are the other things around there. And for a human, they will also include social-cultural. So this is over time. And the environment would be ambient light. Is it the temperature, the surface of the ground? Are there other horses around? All those other things. And all of those are taken into consideration. And we can change what we're asking the horse to do by changing some of those constraints. So we talk about constraint manipulation. And this has been done with horses for probably ever, because we can't talk to them. However, most people constrain to constrain, and we want to constrain to afford. So I'll just explain that a little bit better. Constraining to constrain would do things like putting a tie down on a horse so it can't move. So I want you to be in this exact position, and I'm going to physically put a task constraint in so that you have to be there. Constraining to afford is trying to take away something that they're doing, but then not specifying what they can do instead. So you leave other options open. And there are, which is a little bit harder to begin with to think about.
So can you give us an example of that, Marianne? Can you give us an example of constraining to afford?
Yeah, certainly. So, I mean, some of the stuff that's probably would be, for me, really obvious that we would do, perhaps, is having poles on the ground. That mean that a horse kind of like will slow down and pick their feet up. I can get my horse to bend its hocks by having poles on the ground. Okay, which is really simple. And like I say, we always use this, but we're not telling the horse how to do it. Yeah, the poles are there. The horse chooses how to go over it, and then you can do other things. So long grass, works just as well. There are lots of things that we can do that if we want that nice trot, pop them in some shallow water, or in a field of very long grass, you'll get a similar thing. And I know you can't always do all those different bits, but trying to think like, what do I want where do I want the horse to go, roughly? So keeping those. Well, and we'll make sure we pick this up later. We don't want really restrictive movement solutions. We want the horse to have a wider toolbox as long as it's carrying the rider, and we're not teaching it to do it wrong. We're just teaching them to be more agile and versatile and anti-fragile. So that's kind of a really key bit. Other things that you can do is use terrain. So you've got a horse that needs to build up its hind end and bring its balance back. Just working on a slope, so it goes downhill, it'll bring all the weight back, because otherwise it'll fall forward. And we call that feeding an error. So I'm not going to tell them what to do, but if I put a little bit of slope, and then the horse is like, oh, I need to rearrange my weight, and a little bit of an uphill slope, they need to push off from the hind end. So, and again, I know lots of people use a lot of these things already. So an example of something then that's not good would be stuff like wrapping. And I know, or polling or whatever you call it, and I know it's illegal, and people still do it because they think, oh, I'm teaching the horse proprioception. But what you're doing there is teaching the horse not to trust its perceptual information. So when we see learning as being around becoming very skillful at picking up affordances, so the horse can look at a jump and they're like, that's jumpable, that type perception action coupling is really important. And if, by tricking the horse by moving the pole, then they're just learning that that perception action coupling wasn't there. It's really fundamentally messing up their skill development, which generally you can tell a horse that's had that, because they don't want anybody standing at the side of the jumps when they're jumping. And the idea that you can teach a horse to pull its front feet up by doing that, a horse will only lift its front feet up if it needs to. So this is that important bit around perception action coupling. They don't learn a program, they learn to interact with their environment. So you can put ground lines and all sorts of stuff in, and when you take the ground lines away, the horse will jump as they would without a ground line. They're not going to remember and have a program that they did with a ground line. And that doesn't mean you don't use them, or you don't use trotting poles or placing poles. It's just like what they're not teaching the horse a program. So the horse is going to make a different shape when they're not there.
Is one of the things that the horse is going to do any of these movements in the most efficient manner? They're not going to be extravagant. That is not, in the absence of any other type of training, they're not going to be extravagant. Their movement is going to be efficient because that's what it needs to be.
Brilliant question, Meta. Initially, definitely yes. And when you watch a horse and a rider together, one of the things I think that's really useful and very different about this is when you look at them, you don't say, they're making these errors. You want to look at them and say, this is their movement system's current best solution. Mm-hmm. This is the movement system's current best solution. How do I give it more solutions, more capacity? So one of the things we could build is capacity, and horses do learn to move extravagantly. And this is a fascinating one, because we want them to move as if they are highly aroused, but we want them not to behave highly aroused, because then we think, oh God, that's a bit scary. So we're trying to get them to make the shapes that go with a certain emotion, hopefully without getting too excited. And of course they get excited, because making those shapes kicks out loads of great, nature's pharmacies and all sorts of neurotransmitters and things, which is wonderful. And they will do those. So we can get them to make those shapes, and we can certainly add some of the more behaviourist techniques. Once you've got them moving, just give them a cue, and they do that. But I think again, they're not being I know this is supposed to be what we want is self-expression and self-carriage, which means what that horse can do, rather than something that we're going to impose that it isn't, it's too difficult, or is just dysfunctional for their physiology or their stage of learning. So yeah, they will go efficient. And actually, this is probably worth mentioning. So with this non-linearity, and Karen, I don't know if you've seen this in the sort of system stuff that you've done. One example that I can give is if you want your horse to make a better shape over a jump, warm up and build the jumps up, and then build a jump that helps them make that shape. Or a height, because if it's a low jump, they're like, well, I can just kind of trot up and hop over it. And it tends to be about a metre, where so it might go, I think I better sort my canter out. I don't have to ask them to sort the canter out. They start to self-organise, and they'll sort out a better canter, and then they'll make a better shape of the jump. Then because we have this sort of hysteresis, this non-linearity, you can then, in the short term, drop the jumps back down again, and they will continue to make a better shape, and they'll do that phase transition back to a more efficient one, lower than they made it on the way up, if that makes sense. So on the way up, they might change it about a metre or so, but on the way down, they might change shape about 70, 80 centimetres. So that's a good thing. Go up and then come back down again and play, and you should still get some shape.
Mm-hmm. That sounds really curious. The question that I was going to ask was, you mentioned about the perception action coupling, I think, or is that, yes, or perception behaviour. I just wondered if you could explain that a little bit more, just because if people are not familiar with that, it might seem a bit hard to understand.
Yeah, definitely. And this is a really cool bit that underpins. So instead of our action being guided by some kind of motor program internally, it is guided by intention, but also by perceptual information. So, so so if you change the shape of your jump, and people know if I put a big cross, my horse is going to make a different shape. If it's moving to one side, I can put a pole at the side, and push my horse to the middle, or push it a little bit to the side. It's not going to, for example. So again, intuitively we can do this. If you put something on the ground on the other side of a jump, because then that's a potentially unsafe landing space for the horse, they'll jump differently. So that movement is being controlled through perceptual information as well as intention. It's the perceptual information in the moment, including haptic information, which is touch and pressure from the rider. That's our the way in which they pick up information from us. Now, what this means for practice is that it's really important that you have the information that is going to be what we call specifying, so the information that is controlling movements in practice that you're going to have in performance. So, for example, if you are going to be jumping on grass, then you want to be practicing on grass. If you're going to be jumping without a ground pole, you want to do some practice without a ground pole. If you're going to be jumping with a crowd that's going to disrupt a horse's attention, try and find some practice to do things like that. So we can't take what we call non-representative, so not to be confused with internal representation, practice that doesn't look like the final thing. But it doesn't have to be exactly the same. This doesn't mean, I need to go and jump an entire round at X heights with a big crowd. Although people do that. So try and have like slices of the real environment and see what you can do. But also change them around and see how different the horse might be in different environments. So give it those different surfaces and different environments to be in.
I'm finding this fascinating, Marianne. My background is racing. Well, it's more on the breeding side, but I'm very, very interested in racing, have been all my life. And a lot of the things that trainers do would involve some of the stuff you're talking about. They'll bring their horse to a racetrack on a non-race day just to get them used to the environment of the parade ring and cantering down to the start and going through the stalls and doing a short breeze just to be in that environment. So it's not unfamiliar what you're describing.
Yeah, I think it's probably, and this might be a bit, you might find this a little bit controversial. With horses, one of the things I think we do is it's almost like if this was a human, we kind of leave them in the house on the sofa watching Netflix till they finish their teenage years, and then we kind of get them out to start a sport, and you go, hang on a bit, so they're born on a flat surface that doesn't give any stimulation to their hooves to grow or their bones, or it's not wobbly, and they're not having to adjust their movement to walk on uneven ground and be on even ground, and then we put them in a nice flat paddock with other young horses. I just think it's not about riding them, but like what kind of environment would stimulate really good movement adaptation. And and weirdly it's the opposite of what people think will keep them safe. That will keep them safe because you will have agile, adaptive horses that can climb over rocks and move up and down slopes and things, and be in a herd hopefully with adults as well. That will give you a really good little athlete before you start, rather than this perfect.
Yeah. Because we go to we have a stud farm ourselves. We go to other really fancy stud farms with beautifully manicured walkways, often rubber, all sorts of lovely things. Gosh, wouldn't this be fabulous? And what you're saying is actually what we have, which is a variety of surfaces. I don't think we've rocks, but we have a variety of surfaces, but that they have to negotiate. And you're saying that's actually a good thing.
A really good thing. Surfaces, inclines, stuff like that. I know people use things like a track system now for barefoot horses, but that's just really good for movements. I'm hopefully part of the way through writing a paper with somebody around what movement patterns horses need to be able to do in order to be functionally healthy. And based on a lot of the research initially from humans, but if we have horses who are kept in a stable for a long period of time, and I know that sometimes people can't help that. Mine has this winter for the first time ever. She has 3 hours turnout. She's now at 24/7, thank God. So you're in a stable, then they might be on a horse walker, then they're being ridden or hacked. They have no agency of their movement at any point, and their movement is being restricted. So I think the key thing here is to kind of let go of the idea of perfect biomechanics and repetition and think about how can I have a big movement toolbox, and we call repetition without repetition. So doing similar things but moving in different ways, because our bodies are not machines. They have multiple ways to solve the same problem, and it's really important to do that. And so having somewhere where they can have some free space and move in different ways, climb up, climb down, lean on things, as in, just so important for them, and it's difficult. At some point, they need to be able to run and buck and kick and strike and do all the things that horses do. Obviously not every day, but have the opportunity to use their full movement repertoire so that they stay, first of all, they get healthy, and then they stay healthy, and they're not fragile to stress fractures and things like that.
It's interesting you talk about that lack of agency, in that sort of regime. We were talking to someone the other day about designing enclosures and creating habitat for endangered species. And one of his sort of key things that he has worked out through his research is that movement with purpose is one of the key things for good welfare for animals. And it's just really interesting hearing you talking about the different environments for the horses. So biomechanically, it's really important. But if we get what we've learned from Mike Vesey, his research, it's that mentally important for their welfare, as well as the biomechanics side of it.
And for learning. And that is absolutely it, movement with purpose. And the purpose is the horse is the one who is engaging in that purposefully, intentionally. So when we talk about setting movement problems, that's it. So if we think about, he will be designing an environment that's got lots of affordances for the horse to behave naturally. So places to hide, nice high places for them to look out for, different spaces to explore, different environments to explore. And again, we want to, rather than having this nice flat manicured lawn with a pretty white picket fence, like how can we create an affordance rich, things to step over, things to jump over, that a horse has to walk across a different surface to get to the water, and then maybe jump over something little like a stream to get back to the food. How can we create an environment where they are moving, but there's a purpose? The horse chooses how they do that. And then we take the same thing into our training environments. So if you're doing dressage, for example, maybe do a bit of working equitation. If you want your horse to bend, do one of the 3-leaf clover exercises that you might find in working equitation, because there's a clear purpose. Once the horse learns the game, they can be actively engaging in movements with a purpose. They learn much quicker. They can organise their body much quicker. They can be in self-carriage. They're not going to forget, because you've got that nice contextual interference effect there of it's not just rote repetition of something that makes no sense to the horse. So you just get masses of bang for your buck from it. They're, like you say, welfare, learning, all of it, good movements, as well as mental welfare. They're stimulated, they're engaged. They don't, like us, they don't learn when they're scared. They don't learn when it's repetition.
So, Marianne, I've come to this whole world very late. I was an equine vet with an interest in horses, with a professional interest in horses. Never was really a rider, but I did a master's in animal welfare at the University of Edinburgh. One of our modules was equitation science, based on learning theory, which in turn came from human learning theory. And to me, that was a whole new world. So in some ways, is this an extension of learning theory? Is it parallel to learning theory? Where does it fit in?
Good question. Very good question. Right. There are lots of learning theories. So, and equitation science just uses behaviorism, so operant classical conditioning. Yeah. Mm-hmm. the one thing that and ecological psychology has in common is they're both what we call non-representative. So we're not expecting movement programs inside the individual. So there's a similarity there. Yes, reinforcement and things like that, that's obviously very powerful and they do work. Ecological, so the two big differences then, behaviorism as a learning theory is what we call passive. It's passive learning. The person who's doing the teaching is basically the puppeteer. Yeah? So you're going to learn what I want you to learn, you move the way I want you to move, etc. So it's not active, it's not, and there is an agency of the individual. So we also then still have this hierarchy between the human and the horse, and the human dictating what the horse should do rather than teaching the horse to be skillful. The other thing, so one of the things that's really powerful about that is it's a really good way for us to build communication with the horse. You know, to say, I'd like you to do X is very good if we reinforce it. But what learning theory doesn't do is support how they actually move. So they are different. And that is, for me, quite interesting that proponents who very much of that behaviourist learning theory struggle with an ecological perspective. This is different. It's a different theory of learning that is based around an organism's continual engagement within an environment and becoming skillful through that, not just through positive and negative reinforcement, but through intention as well.
I was at a veterinary behaviourist conference a few months ago, and I was in the lunch queue, someone I didn't know in front of me, we were just chit-chatting, and she said, have you read Marianne Davies' paper? I said, I've looked at it. I said, I found it very dense, very technical, but I said, I'm sure there's something in it. Oh, she said, you must read it again, which I did. And I suppose my understanding now, I'm just not as academically advanced as either of you, but my understanding is that what in the coaching that you're proposing, or that, because this comes from your coaching background, the coaching is about giving the horse opportunity, and the rider, the dyad, opportunities to practice with variations in the environment in which they're practicing, so that when it comes to the performances needed, they will have tools, as you say, a toolbox of ways of dealing with the blaring horn that suddenly goes off, or whatever it might be, a jump that's on a different line to what they would have been used to at home, but they can recalibrate, readjust, and get the result. So it's kind of freeing them up to have these choices when it comes to the performance. Is that the lay summary?
That's a good summary. I think there's a little bit more to it that as well. It's in that also we try and design an activity if we want them to learn rather than tell them what to do, whether that's a coach telling a rider or a rider telling the horse. Trying to think of good. So a really good example for a rider, perhaps. You know, quite often one of the most important things is having a stable lower leg, and that lower leg in a good place, and being able to balance over it. So instead of telling the rider, put your leg back, put your heel down, whatever, and get them to do exercises like trots in, we call it post or rising, then sit, then hover, then post and rise, because that exercise gets the rider's body of whatever, and like I say, it's their best solution at the time, so it tells you what they're able to do. They're having to constantly balance over that lower leg while they change and move and get in time with the horse, so that little exercise is going to do way more than anything you tell them or shout at them as a coach, because what you're actually doing now is giving them a problem that means they have to balance over their lower leg, otherwise they can't do it. So that will be a classic good constraints activity. And especially if you take the reins away, if they're leaning on those, you take the reins away and then see if you can still do that activity. And again, scale it up and down. I think a really, really important bit, that's worth talking about as well, is that levels of challenge. So quite often people will put something up and say, oh, well, the horse could do this. It could do it yesterday. I was like, well, it might have DOMs today. It might have, not be feeling great. All sorts of reasons why that could be problematic. And so this idea that it's just, it could do it yesterday, it could do it last week, it can still do that. We have that, in real time action capabilities. But we can make things easier and more difficult. And one of the easiest ways to make things easy for a horse is to have a friend with them, so have another horse in an arena instead of them being on their own. How can I change the environment that makes this less threatening to the horse so that I can up the challenge of the activity? Rather than expect it just to deal with the challenge and then a perceived threat as well. So even tiny things like letting go of something being too perfect, giving them a little bit more space to organise themselves instead of overcorrecting, because then the horse is always wrong. You've made a mistake. It's just like, well, that was, instead of go, oh, that's interesting. Maybe I need to make this exercise a little bit easier, and then go hard and then easy again. Play around with those levels so you keep the horse being optimally challenged whilst removing the threat. So that would be another way to play with this idea, rather than thinking, oh, I've just got to condition it to accept. We don't want horses conditioned. We want them actively engaged. That's when we're going to get the best out of them. So we can play around with how do we, from a horse's perspective, how do we reduce the threat so that we can up the challenge in these activities.
I think it might help people to, and I don't know if it's going to be possible, but if you could explain a difference in the mindset of approaching training and getting where you want to go.
Yes, I think so. And again, I also think back to how we coach children. So there is actually a big parallel between horses and children. And I try and think with my horse, I never want to do anything with my horse that I wouldn't do with a child. If we go back 30, 40 years, people would hit children. They would shout at them. They would, the children had to do what they were told. Very prescriptive. So we talk about very coach-centered, very prescriptive learning. And that's moved, the dial's moved hugely. Still needs to move in many places where the child is centered in this. So it's, child sport, we want to be, if I quote a friend of mine, Mark O'Sullivan, who does stuff in football, he says, as many as possible, as long as possible, in as good an environment as possible. We kind of want the same thing for the horse. So if we center the horse in everything that we do, so we it's not human centric and hierarchical. It's not about them being machines that do what we want them to do. That we center the horse, then we can start to think about this differently. So what's the experience of the horse? How do I help the horse enjoy this? Hopefully, and I believe they can do, and they do. They they get pleasure from moving as well as we do. I guess nature kitted everyone out. Well, they do. They have all the same endorphins and neurotransmitters that we do. So the movement and play is really important for them. So how do we make what we're doing work for the horse-centric, and think about the horse's experience from the horse's perspective, instead of us thinking that they are being naughty, or they're, that they're not learning fast enough, or that they should be on this linear progression that they're not fitting into. And then I think once we do that, then that changes everything. And, and your time can be more playful. So that's the first thing. More playful, be curious, but that's interesting. That's my horse's best solution now. How can I help? Rather than, oh, my horse was really good yesterday and today it's being naughty, lazy, whatever. So I think that's the key thing. It's a completely different way of thinking about that from the horse's perspective. Now, from the rider's perspective, riding traditionally, again, has come from the same roots, ontological, so theories of reality as other sports coaching, and tends to be about what somebody's doing. It's just the movement, not the perception action coupling. Now, the really important bit is, what are they perceiving? So when you're coaching, the key bit is not that somebody is the lower leg is not in the right position, but it's like, what is it what information are they picking up through their body that is informing the way they are sitting or the way they are riding? And how can you change the activity so that they have to find a different solution? Because we've just been looking at one bit, the bit that's easy for the coach to see, with an illusion that something that looks a certain way is functional, but it's not necessarily. Again, with children, a lot of the instructions were trying to error correct children to look like an adult Olympian male, because that's the perfect technique, which is ridiculous. When you think about it, of course they're not going to look like that. And again, the child is always wrong because they're not looking like an adult Olympic male. So instead of them building solutions, and over the years those solutions becoming more functional, we're always correcting them. We're reducing. It's like pruning a tree instead of allowing it to blossom. We don't want a pruned tree in the horse or the rider. We want them both to be really functional and agile, and all the stuff that we say, oh look, they're naturally talented, and you go, guess what? They spent their time when they were kids ragging around playing with their ponies with nobody telling them what to do, and that's why they're naturally talented, because they've learnt without you error correcting them into this dysfunctional, very narrow band where they're often thinking about what they look like. So we've got that internal focus of attention. Oh, I must look up. Oh, I must keep my hands still. That's not the important information. The important information is, like looking where they're going, feeling what the horse is doing underneath them. That's what a coach should be, I think, helping riders to pick up.
What a beautiful transition. Thanks so much, Marianne, because what I'd like to ask you about now is a little bonus for our coaches out there, which is, can you talk about your approach for coaching and how coaches might want to try this out, how they could in a practical sense offer some help to their students?
Another good question. I think so. The first challenge actually for coaches is the expectations of riders, and that's the same in many sports. So if somebody's coming to you because you're going to joystick coach them, you're going to ride their horse for them from the ground, then it's actually quite difficult. You might have to have a conversation around, I'm going to help you to become more autonomous, for you to be able to make good decisions, so you can ride your horse when I'm not here and be safe and make good decisions. And there could be a whole other conversation in there around confidence and why riders often lose confidence unless they've got somebody coaching them. You just go, well, you need to learn to make your own decisions, which means you need to learn to pick up that perception information again. We're back to perception information. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I would say is either do it with co-coach with some other people as well. So find somewhere where it's safe for you to explore, because as a coach you need to be able to explore and practice in order to get better too. And a lot of coaches often tell me that they find coaching a little bit like flying an aeroplane that's full of passengers, and they're like, I can't experiment because I don't want to, because there's a high risk. So I completely get that, but it's really important. The learning, the way you learn is the same as the rider and the same as the horse that we've spoken about. You need to be able to design activities and explore and see what happens and then change them. So point number 2 is find a safe time. And it might be you go, right, for the warm-up, we're going to just play with a little bit of kind of like gymkhana games or working equitation type stuff. So, and this is why. So it's just a small part of a lesson that you do with people. And then think about what you're seeing and how you can design an activity that helps them find a solution instead of you telling them. And it doesn't mean that you can't tell them. You can say, look, what I need you to be able to do is look up. So, because you're not looking where you're going. So I'm going to design an activity that requires you to go and look for a target. I might change them. So, and you can make stuff. So we talk about amplifying information. So you might have maybe coloured cones or coloured jumps or something, and then as they're moving around, you got to go to the green one. So now they've got to look. So it's that meaningful information. Going back to exactly the same as as your friend is designing spaces for feral ponies. Because there's no point looking, and if you don't have to, of course we're not going to look. We're going to be exactly the same as the horse. We're going to use the minimum amount of effort that we need to, So if somebody's, slouched, but it might be that they need to build more core stability. So do core stability exercises instead of trying to, what I call, ice a raw cake. Don't try and do something fancy if they haven't got the basic movement. If you have to have big blocks and too much internal focus to stay on your horse, do something easier while you build up, that capacity.
So the assumption, just like it is for the horse, it's the same for the rider, that they're really offering you the best solution they can at that moment in time. So that whether it's because they're tired or they don't have enough balance yet or whatever it might be that might be causing that issue that you would dearly like as a coach to sort of correct. But at the time, they're giving you the best that they can, we assume, just like the horse.
Yes. So instead of you as a coach correcting, so now you're doing the problem solving, you're getting their focus internally, they're not learning to pick up the information and organise themselves. Instead of doing that, try and think, can I design an activity or can I put something in there? So, again, just some simple stuff that I do. The little, I don't know if you have them there, but kids have, it's like a ping pong ball in a little cup, but it's attached with string. And so it falls out. And the idea, what the kids do is they throw them up and catch them. But you can have those in your hands when you're riding. So that if your hands wobble, the balls fall out. And that's such a good way to get people to keep their hands still and just be a bit more. It brings the attention to the hands as well, So there's, try and then it's your imagination. Like I say, it becomes more playful, it becomes more fun, it becomes more fun for the individual. So as a coach, you can ask the rider questions, which is really good because you can't with the horse. But try and find things that are fun, that give them a nice puzzle, a fun puzzle, where in finding the solution, they are learning what you'd like them to learn. And don't expect it to be perfect. Learning takes a long time because it's not just, first of all, they need to be able to pick up the information, which is difficult. We become more attuned to it the more skillful we get. So, one of the things with my study that was really interesting when I was getting skilled riders to do what I call think aloud, which is another great thing to do for yourself as a coach, and then listen to it. Think, what am I saying and what am I paying attention to? Is when they're really skillful, they pick up such subtle information. They can tell which horse is walking past them by the hoof fall. They can tell the quality of a canter instantly. It takes a long time to become attuned to that information. So you can't expect a beginner to pick it up straight away. So find an activity that helps them pick up which foot is on the ground or where it is. Those kind of things, and often a training session that looks a little bit messy and a little bit chaotic, when they come back again, that is when you see what they've learned. So we measure learning at the wrong time. We try and think at the end of a session, oh, look, that looks nicer. We've done this nice repetitive practice and look, that's all beautiful. Your horse is working through. It looks nice and balanced. What does it look like when it comes back? That's the bit that tells you what they've learned. You'll know this, Karen, in research and in movement literature, we can't say something's effective because it's improved during practice. That doesn't tell us anything about learning. That's just getting somebody to chant their 2 times table and saying, look, they've learned their times tables. It's when they come back, and usually more messy, more challenge, more variability, you're going to see an improvement. That's your contextual interference effect when they come back again. More repetitive, more perfect, more nice, more you'll pass your coach award by doing this. Unfortunately, they have this skills drop afterwards, but because they weren't learning, it was just repetitive. So some of it is just changing what you're looking at and where you're measuring your success. It's retention and transfer. Do you see what you're practicing when they're outperforming? Whether that is going hacking or competing at whatever level. That's where you see whether your practice is working, not whether it looks nice at the end of a training session.
And do you notice? Yeah, I think that's so true. And one of the tests I think is a great test is after a horse has been turned out for a little while. If you turn a horse out for a month and bring the horse back in and jump on, and it's pretty much just like as if you rode them a week ago or a day ago. I think that's a great sign that the horse has really learnt whatever lesson it is you've tried to teach, which in many cases is just allowing you to ride the horse.
Absolutely, yeah. And if you've got things like fade of something that you've taught them after time, then that was passive learning, and it wasn't. It doesn't stay. It disappears over time. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I used to when my although not that they competed or did stuff at a high level, but when she came back into work after having a fall, I hadn't done anything with her for 9 months. Just got straight back on her. She was perfect. It was like she needed to build some strength again, but other than that, no difference. Off work for years, 4 years, just done a little bit of stuff, but yeah, no different.
I'm interested in your work coaching coaches. Obviously the very same principles apply.
Yes.
And are there differences? How do you have to adjust your style for humans as opposed to the human horse diet when you're coaching a coach?
In many ways, no. So I still try and do a similar thing. So now, although I'll send to the coach, and again, the coach needs to learn to pick up information, which is why I said it's really good if you're coaching, if you can subtly just stick a mic on yourself and just record what you say and what you do. But it'll let you know what you're paying attention to, and if you can video yourself, even better. But becoming aware of what you're perceiving, what are you noticing, what you're paying attention to, as much as what you're doing.
This is you as the coach of the coaches.
This is you as the coach, and of them as the coaches. So we kind of have the same thing. You're still going to go. Learning is still the same. They still need to be able to problem solve. They still need to be able to pick up specifying information. That information is telling me that, this rider lacks postural stability or dynamic stability, for example. That's the key thing that we need to develop here, or that. Just confidence in the horse, which would be about being able to mostly pick up information so they can make good decisions rather than not know what's happening. Whatever it is. So, how are you as a coach, what are you paying attention to? And again, a lot of coaching is, coaching is complex, it's dynamic, it's relational. We don't know. It's defined as a low validity learning environment. It's very hard to know exactly what you did that worked or didn't work, because it's so complex. And if you did, it would be really easy. You just say to everybody, if you do X, your swimmer will win the Olympics. And we can't do, that doesn't work. So kind of the same thing. How coaches need to learn actively, being engaged. A lot of our coach ahead is very tick box, do a demonstration, why they don't need one, or, tell this, why. So think about why you're doing what you're doing as a coach. What is your understanding of learning? And obviously for me, I look at it from an ecological perspective. How is the horse learning? How is the rider learning? How are they learning together? How do I support them to learn, to have more solutions? Not the right solution, more solutions, always more solutions. Obviously, there are some things you don't want to do, and that's a difference. So anything that you think might cause, injury or is going to be really problematic in the future, don't repeat them. Usually we have problems from repetition rather than from making a not correct movement. And don't load it. So if your horse isn't lifting its back up and carrying a rider, don't put a heavy rider on them. If they're don't constrain their neck because you're going to put shear forces on the spine. This matter. So those are the things to stay away from rather than, they're not perfectly straight.
And again, did I take from your paper when you talked about things like draw reins that people are artificially putting a horse into the desired shape, so they're kind of reaching, or think they're reaching the end goal instead of working with various changes in the environment and things that, so what you're kind of saying, I think, is that you reduce the options. You're kind of funneling them in a direction you want them to go to end up in that desired shape, but there's ways of getting there. It's not just one way.
Yeah, I'd almost say I'm funneling them away from where I don't want them to go rather than towards where I do want them to go. So we try and take away an option with a constraint rather than give one. Usually, yeah, so that would be more accurate. And again, if you put draw reins, all you're doing is it's going back to the same with the horse and the rider. That shape is correct, whereas it's not a shape. It's about power and activation through a kinematic chain that matters. To the horse, their dynamic balance. So in movements, I don't know. Think about a horse in the wild turning a corner to escape from a predator. If you look at them, they're going to look more like a horse doing barrel racing than they are like a dressage horse, aren't they? They're not going to be like perfectly upright and beautiful position and stuff like that. And that is their movements. That is them owning movements, and it's perfectly functional. That's a good movement pattern for that thing, and horses should be able to do that. It's not wrong because it doesn't look like this perfect classical dressage corner.
And
yeah,
going back to the coach, you mentioned coaching certificates and how that's kind of a tick box. You've done this, you've done that. How far has this ecological theory permeated the coaching world? I mean, in general, in any type of sports coaching. I mean, is it gaining ground? Is it mainstream? I'm just interested.
It's gaining a lot of ground. So a lot of my contemporaries and friends are sort of suddenly getting really cool positions, like Tyler Yerby, who's just finishing his PhD with me in the States. I think he's head of education and development for US ski and snow sport. Fabianotte, head of he's gone I think 3 different big football organisations. Again, now he's just been poached by US football. So huge. I mean, when I wrote the whole section for UK coaching around skill acquisition and ecological dynamics, even 4 years ago there was less sort of conversations about it, and now there's a paper that we're using in work next week for our Research Friday that I run in the organisation, and it's somebody from a very information processing, so very linear perspective, saying, oh well, we can have both of them, because they know that it's moving so fast in that direction. They're trying to go, oh well, we'll just add it, we'll just bolt this on, which in some ways you can, but then when you get to the point where you realise, you start really digging, and it's fine to do that to begin with, you start digging into it, you just go, okay, these aren't compatible in the same worlds. At some point there is something where you have to go, okay, it looks like that from that perspective, and it looks like this from this perspective, and then I have to dig a little deeper, which is cool, so, but until then you just add it to the toolbox. So a lot of people use constraints, even though they haven't quite made the switch in their head into seeing the world as from a complexity perspective, which is so alien to us. It's not what we learned in school. It's not how we're, it is a little bit like stepping into the matrix, isn't it? Or stepping out of it. The whole world suddenly changes. Yeah.
It's in and out at the same time, isn't it?
Yeah. And you just go, wow. And it changes the way you see everything, our environment, our politics, you can't unsee the world that way. And so you can't expect somebody to do that straight away either. Yeah. So explore, be curious. It's fascinating. The coaches who were with me with my PhD, so I had 16 coaches who then came and did a coach development. So that's what I do for a living with all sports. Session with this, and then I basically did a semi-structured interview with them every month for 7 months and followed their progress. Just said, what are you playing with? What are you doing? How are you finding it? The main things, and almost straight away, is they went, this is so much easier. I can relax and pay attention. It's fun. I'm enjoying my coaching. The people I coach are enjoying it. Some of them are so conditioned. They're like, oh no, we don't do that. I don't do fun. Just tell me what to do. I'm like, okay. Lots of them have changed who they will coach. So a lot of them have said to me, there are people who, because of the bits they use and if they hit their horses, I just say, no, I don't want to coach you anymore. And that's cool. But they pretty much just said, the horses have relaxed, the horses have sort of like gone a bit, you know, they're more engaged, they're just not being over controlled, over corrected. So which is brilliant. I mean, I'm really excited about being able to write that up across the whole thing. And then they're saying, actually, it's the other stuff. It's the expectations. It's the parents. It's the people thinking this is what a session should look like. Dressage session is me standing in the middle shouting, more leg, kind of thing, and they're like, no, not any. That's not what it's going to look like anymore.
The reason I asked the question was because I imagine one of the things we strive for with our horses is we want this lovely flowing movement, both from ourselves in the way that we ride. We want to sit softly. We don't want to be braced. And I was just curious if you see a transformation with that change in coaching in terms of just the way the riders sit and feel when they're sitting on the horse, as well as the way the horses move themselves.
Because I didn't see them, but they talked about that. And we haven't talked about freeing degrees of freedom, which is another thing. So again, the minute you think about what you're doing internally, like, am I sitting straight? Not only is your focus moved away from feeling what your horse is doing underneath you, but you've also frozen your movement degrees of freedom, which means you can't be with the horse. You're almost doing the opposite of what you need to do, which is to feel the horse and allow your body to self-organize with that movement. And again, it's not about sitting straight, it's about building dynamic balance. So you might look straight, but somebody who's and I know actually Celeste, I can't remember her surname, there's some research been done recently and they've shown exactly that. The still riders are the beginners, they're trying to be correct, and then they'll be still, and then they'll wobble, and then they'll try and be rigid, and then they'll wobble, because they're not haptically connected to the horse. Elite riders are moving all the time, constantly, always moving. They look still because they're constantly connected and they're coupled to the horse. So we don't want the rider to think about staying still. We want the rider to think about the connection and the movement of the horse, and even exaggerate it, get them to exaggerate the movement, because balance is being able to go out of balance and come back. It's not being able to be still. If you look at postural sway, for example, a human being who hasn't got a good bit of posture, although we look like we're standing still, we're not. Postural sway is what keeps us balanced. It's dysfunctional. People who've got really poor motor skills are the ones who've got less postural sway. So because, so we're still trying to coach the wrong thing. Obviously, we don't want masses of movement, but we want some. We want them to move around and be able to come back into balance. We want the horse to be able to go out of balance and come back into balance. That's what gives them balance. But a lot of that is such a big move away from kind of what we think we should be doing, that it takes a bit. It's a bit mind blowing to begin with. But then when they started doing it, they were like, "Oh, look, my horse looks really happy and it's moving." Because of course, horses are very good at self-organizing. They're also very good at catching us. I think I used to joke and say riders should go and do some kayaking, because there's loads of stuff that's really similar, but kayaks don't rescue you. You get out of balance in a kayak, you get wet, you fall out. Whereas horses kind of go like this, and they fill in for us so much that we're not having to be as skillful as you would with something like a kayak.
I think that's a wonderful place to end, Marianne. Acknowledging that the horses are actually catching us and helping us and filling in some of our gaps. I think that's a wonderful place to end. And I've really, really enjoyed our talk today. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast and sharing all this information. Certainly a different perspective and a different way of thinking about things, but one that is so rich and offers so many opportunities for people. It is a little bit red pill, blue pill, like the Matrix.
I know.
Karen and I often talk about the tent that we're in, with all these different people with different perspectives and different theories and different approaches, and this has been a really, really interesting corner of the tent, and I really feel like we're going to hear, we're obviously going to hear more perspectives, but I think this is going to be an important one going forward. So thank you so much, Marianne. Really, really appreciated having you on.
You're very welcome.
What I'd like
Thank
to
you
do
so much for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure.